Hello, and welcome to another Behind the Poem story. Today's Behind the Poem story marks the last kind of section of my stories that have not yet been told. Now, for some reasons, some of the reasons why these poems have waited till the end is because they are particularly special, like Coordinates of Home. Some of it is because the stories are a little short, because the idea and the story behind the poem is a little bit more simplistic. Tonight's poem, Innocence, is a little bit on the shorter side because it's kind of does what it says on the tin. So with the poem Innocence, tonight's Behind the Poem story, it's got multiple layers of irony, like a lot of the poems that I've talked about before, but and a lot of the poems that I wrote when I was a teenager. But one of the key features of Innocence as a poem is that it sees innocence as a negative thing. It sees not knowing and a lack of knowledge, or in this particular case, lack of knowledge of romance or what it feels like to be in love as being a negative thing. Now, obviously, as you grow up, you want to learn more. And you get a little bit tired of people telling you, oh, don't worry about it, or you'll understand later, or you'll understand when you grow up. I don't think I've met a single teenager in all 10 years of my teaching, or in all the time before that, that didn't want to grow up faster. And then I don't think I know very many adults who wouldn't wish for the simpler times, for to go back to being a teenager, or going back to being at university, going back to an earlier time when we didn't have to worry about adult things like laundry and dishes and paying rent and bills. So we have this contradiction in life that it expresses itself within the poem Innocence. The desire to know and grow up shows itself in the kind of known unknowns, the juxtaposition of opposites within the poem, because throughout the poem, the narrator talks about wanting to not be innocent anymore, because being innocent means not knowing what you're missing, not knowing the love of someone else, not knowing what it feels like to be in love, what it feels like to throw yourself into it. But in the second half of the poem, the same narrator talks about innocence not being necessarily a lack of knowledge. Innocence becomes, in the second half of the poem, not knowing what it's like to know without taking the consequences of that knowledge. So a lot of times when we don't know a thing, when we don't know something, we don't know what we're missing, that whole ignorance is bliss concept. But a lot of times we know what we're missing, but we don't know the downside of it. So, the downside of knowing what it feels like to be in love is often, especially for teenagers, the discovery of what it means like to fall out of love. Adults too, but this kind of, is a youthful thing that we are kind of designed to look for our partner, but we don't always remember that it doesn't always work. So I think that I wrote this poem in high school after I fell in love for the first time. I think that I had written it in frustration after I had fallen in love for the first time and had my heart broken for the first time. So I was kind of reflecting that frustration of wanting to grow up too quickly, wanting to understand what it felt like to be in love, but then realizing if I didn't know what it was like to feel in love, I wouldn't know what it was like to have that love rejected. So the question towards the end of the poem is, do I regret the knowledge that let me know I wasn't quite as innocent as I thought? Because the narrator within the poem discovers that innocence is not about not knowing what it feels like to be in love. Innocence is about not knowing the consequences of what happens when you fall out. And so since the narrator and I both knew that at the point of writing the poem, maybe we're not as innocent as we thought. And then comes towards the concept of, is it worth it? Is that knowledge worth the consequences of understanding the consequences? Is the knowledge gained when you get rid of innocence worth the possibilities? Now, as an adult, I still work on that. I still wonder whether or not the feeling of being in love and the risk of being in love is worth the consequences that we get when we fall back out of love. I think I always, as a hopeless romantic and that sort of thing, I always kind of come down on the side of it is worth it, given the alternative of being alone all the time. But there are days where I almost wish I didn't know what it felt like to be so much in love, because then I wouldn't know what it felt like to lose it. So I think on balance, the story behind the poem Innocence is a rambling reflection on what actually is meant by innocence. What does it mean to be innocent? And then once that innocence is lost, can it be regained? It's also a reflection on the worth of knowledge. Different ways and different times I explore this in other poems within the collection, but I think that it's an idea that's worth exploring a lot. The concept of what knowledge are we looking for, and is that knowledge worth the cost to learn? So much like my rambling poem, this video has been a bit rambling, but I hope that you kind of see the feeling and the emotion behind the poem Innocence, and I hope you enjoy more of our behind the poem videos, both on my YouTube channel and on my Facebook page for the book, Between Hindsight and Foresight, and I will see you next week. Bye.